It was late 1944. The sky over Europe had changed hands. The once invincible Luftwaffe, masters of the early air war, were now being hunted by squadrons of sleek, silver fighters that seemed to appear from nowhere. The Allies called it the P-51 Mustang. The Germans called it a problem they couldn't outfly. For months, German pilots had reported the same chilling words over the radio. "Es ist wieder dieser Mustang. He heps on me again." Luftwaffe radio transmission, late 1944. No one could match its speed, its climb, or its range. It escorted Allied bombers deep into the heart of Germany, and always came back. But then, something extraordinary happened. Somewhere near Aachen, a P-51 was forced down, remarkably undamaged, captured. To the Luftwaffe's engineers and test pilots, it was a gift from the gods. For the first time they could see and fly, the very machine that had been haunting them across the skies. A small team from the Erprobungsstelle Rechlin, Germany's secret flight testing center, was sent to examine it. Among them was Hauptmann Hans-Werner, a pilot with over 2,000 flight hours in more than 90 aircraft types. He'd flown everything from the Messerschmitt Bf 109 to the revolutionary Me-262 jet. When Lerche saw the Mustang up close, his first words were quiet, almost reverent. "This is something else." They refueled it, replaced what little damage it had, and then, on a cold morning in December 1944, the Luftwaffe did something few would ever believe. They took off in an American fighter. What they discovered in the next 30 minutes of flight would shake the Luftwaffe's confidence and change how they saw the war itself. Feist captured the enemy Sepp's wings, but what they learned in the air was far more than engineering. It was a glimpse into the future they could no longer reach. By late 1943, the air war over Europe had reached its most brutal phase. Every dawn saw hundreds of American B-17 Soared and B-24s lifting off from bases in England, bound for targets deep inside the Third Reich. Their mission cripple Germany's war industry and destroy the Luftwaffe on the ground. The problem was, those bombers flew farther than any escort fighter could follow. At first, American commanders believed their flying fortresses could defend themselves with guns alone. They were wrong. When the escorts turned back, the Luftwaffe pounced. Waves of Bf 109s and F-190s tore into unprotected bomber streams, cutting through them like knives through glass. In a single mission, dozens of bombers vanished in smoke and flame. It was a slaughter, and the Allies knew it couldn't go on. Then, in 1942, a new design appeared, one that would quietly rewrite air combat history. The North American P-51 Mustang. At first, it was just another aircraft, fast, sleek, but nothing extraordinary. Its early Allison engine struggled at high altitude, but when British engineers fitted it with the Rolls-Royce Merlin, everything changed. Suddenly, the Mustang could fly higher, faster, and farther than anything else in the sky. Its range stretched beyond 1,500 miles. Its climb rate and roll speed stunned Allied and Axis pilots alike. It wasn't set just a fighter, it was a guardian. For the first time, bombers had protection all the way to Berlin and back. Luftwaffe losses mounted with every mission. Veteran German aces, once legends of the sky, were being hunted by young American pilots flying the new machine. By 1944, the balance had shifted, the hunter had become the hunted. And yet, among the wreckage and ruins, Germany still had something few nations possessed, an unmatched tradition of aviation science and test engineering. At Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's top-secret testing base, German pilots had flown every aircraft imaginable, theirs and the enemy's. When a Mustang fell into their hands, it was more than curiosity. It was a chance to understand how they had lost the sky. But understanding sometimes hurts more than ignorance. Because, as they prepared to fly the enemy Sepp's masterpiece, they would come face to face with their own fading empire of the air. They were not frontline fighters anymore. By late 1944, the men of Erprobungsstelle Rechlin, Germany's secret test flight division, had become the final keepers of the Reich's aviation legacy. They had flown everything, Messerschmitts, Focke-Wulfs, Junkers bombers, captured Spitfires, even the new Me-262 jet. But when word came that a perfectly intact P-51 Mustang had been recovered, even these veterans felt something different. Hauptmann Hans-Werner Lurch was the kind of pilot who measured life not in years but in aircraft. He'd survived years of test flights, emergency landings and prototype malfunctions. He was known for his calm and his curiosity. In his flight log, Lurch later wrote, "There stood the Mustang, elegant, purposeful. The Allies had truly built a weapon with soul." But Lurch wasn't stumped alone. With him stood Oberleutnant Karl Bahl, chief test pilot for Messerschmitt, and a small team of engineers and mechanics. They were proud men, trained in a system that believed German engineering was the best in the world. To them, flying an enemy aircraft wasn't just a technical challenge, it was a test of national pride. They had seen their airfields bombed to dust. They'd watched friends vanish into fire in the skies over Berlin. And now, the same enemy whose planes filled their nightmares was offering them, unknowingly, one last chance to fly something perfect. We examined the cockpit. Everything was in its place, yet simple. Instruments clear, controls precise. Nothing wasted, nothing over-engineered. The Americans had made flying effortless. That last word, effortless, lingered in the air like a confession. Because by 1944, nothing in Germany was effortless anymore. Fuel was scarce, morale was collapsing, factories ran on borrowed time. The men at Rechlin knew this test wasn't just about performance data. It was about understanding why they were losing. One mechanic later recalled, "It was strange, painting the black cross over the white star. We felt we were erasing something that would not be forgotten." When the morning came, the air was still, the frost sharp. Lurch climbed into the cockpit of an American legend, wearing a German uniform. He glanced once at the swastika on his sleeve, then at the Mustang's curved canopy and distant horizon. For a moment, perhaps, the war fell away, and all that remained was a man and a machine. The Merlin's growl echoed across the field, deeper, smoother, unlike any Daimler or Junkers engine they'd known. The Luftwaffe pilots looked on, silent. Lurch nodded to the ground crew, throttled up, and began to roll. They had no idea that what came next would shake every assumption they held about air combat and about themselves. At 8:42 on a frozen December morning in 1944, Hauptmann Hans-Werner Lurch pushed the throttle forward, and the captured Mustang began to move. At first, the men on the ground expected the usual vibration, strain, perhaps the awkward pull of an unfamiliar engine. Instead, the Merlin purred, smooth, confident, alive. The Mustang lifted effortlessly from the runway. Lurcher raised the gear, eased the stick, and immediately felt something he hadn't expected. Balance. The controls were harmonized beyond belief. He later wrote in his report, "Every movement answered as if the machine anticipated me." German aircraft of the time, the Bofh 109C, the FW 190S, were masterpieces of precision, but also complexity. They demanded constant correction, brute strength, and experience. The Mustang, however, seemed to fly with the pilot, not against him. Lurcher performed a gentle climb, then a roll, then a dive from 10,000 feet. Each maneuver confirmed the same truth. This aircraft was not just fast, it was forgiving. Even at high speed, it responded like an extension of his own reflexes. At 20,000 feet, Lurch pushed the throttle full open, 67 inches of manifold pressure. The Mustang surged forward, climbing at nearly 3,500 feet per minute. No torque pull, no nose drop. He glanced at the altimeter, 25,000 feet, and still climbing. It was here that his professionalism faltered for just a moment. In his flight log, he scribbled, "Never before have I flown a machine that handles this naturally. I felt for the first time in years the joy of flight, not the burden of it." That line, the joy of flight, carried more weight than it seemed. Because by late 1944, joy was something the Luftwaffe had long forgotten. Their pilots were dying faster than they could be trained. Their fuel was rationed to a few drops per day. And in the skies above them, the Allies owned the daylight. As Lurch banked toward home, he realized something unsettling. If the Allies could produce fighters of this caliber in such numbers, the war was already lost. "We cannot match this," he admitted quietly over the radio. "Not in performance, not in endurance, and not in spirit." On the ground, the other pilots watched the Mustang streak overhead, elegant, precise, graceful. Even from below they could see the difference. Oberleutnant Barr turned to a colleague and said only one word: "Unbelievable." Lurch climbed out, silent. The air smelled of oil and frost. He handed his notes to the officer in charge, then stared back at the aircraft, the enemy SEPS aircraft, and muttered, "We have built weapons. They have built a pilot SEPT's dream." The test wasn't set over, but already deep down, they knew the Luftwaffe had met the future, and it wore American wings. Within days of Hans-Werner Lurch's flight, the report reached Berlin. Pages of precise notes, technical charts, and a single haunting conclusion: the Mustang represents a standard of design and control integration superior to our current fighters. It was a message no one wanted to hear. By 1944, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of the force that once dominated Europe's skies. Factories lay in ruins from Allied bombing. Fuel shortages grounded entire squadrons. And now this, a report from their best test pilot, admitting that the enemy's machine outclassed them in every way. For an air force built on pride, the truth was unbearable. Inside the corridors of the Reichsluftfahrt Ministerium, the Air Ministry, engineers debated, denied, even ridiculed the findings. Some claimed the test must have been exaggerated. Others insisted the Mustang's success was only due to mass production, not mastery. But Lurch's name carried weight, and so did his data. As the reports circulated, they ignited quiet despair among Germany's pilots. Frontline flyers who'd once believed the Bay 109 and Evlu 190 were untouchable now whispered stories of Mustangs appearing from the sun, silent, unstoppable, lethal. They seemed to fly forever. Recalled one Luftwaffe survivor years later. Horst dive away, and they would still be there. The test pilots at Rechlin continued their evaluations, stalling tests, gunnery runs, high-altitude turns. Each confirmed the same painful reality. The P-51 wasn't just well-made, it was well thought. Even the cockpit layout told a story of difference. Where German fighters buried gauges in clutter and switches, the Mustang's instruments were intuitive, placed where a pilot's instincts expected them. It wasn't arrogance that had doomed the Luftwaffe, it was isolation. German engineering had chased brilliance for brilliance. Sets, while the Allies built machines for the men who had to survive inside them. It was as if, one mechanic said later, the Americans had asked their pilots what they needed, and then listened. For the men at Rechlin, the realization was both awe and heartbreak. They could appreciate the beauty of what they saw, but also what it meant. The war was unwinnable, not only on the ground or in numbers, but in philosophy. "The machine does not lie," he wrote in his diary. "We have lost the mastery of the air, not by courage, but by vision." And as his words spread quietly among pilots and engineers, morale began to crumble. If even their best, the men who tested the impossible, admitted defeat, what hope remained for those still flying over Berlin? The Luftwaffe had reached its breaking point, not from an enemy bullet, but from a truth too heavy to deny. When Hans-Werner Lurch's flight report reached the upper levels of the Luftwaffe, it didn't vanish into denial, not entirely. Among the engineers and test pilots, it sparked something rare in the closing days of the Reich: honesty. They couldn't match the Mustang's simplicity, its grace, or its endurance. But perhaps they could leapfrog it. By early 1945, Germany turned desperately toward innovation through desperation. If they could no longer dominate the present, they would try to invent the future. The Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, became their final gamble. Faster than anything in the sky, armed with cannons that could tear through bombers in seconds, It seemed the answer to every prayer the Luftwaffe still dared whisper. But it came too late. Fuel was nearly gone, runways lay cratered. Pilots had hours, not weeks, of training before being thrown into combat. Even the revolutionary jets couldn't be built in numbers that mattered. Still, the captured Mustang Sept's lessons lingered. In quiet corners of Rechlin and Oberpfaffenhofen, engineers began rethinking their designs. They studied ergonomics, control balance, cockpit visibility, lessons they'd never fully embraced before. Lurkerset's notes circulated quietly among technical circles. The Mustang's control harmony stems from design empathy, not excess. It serves the pilot, not the designer Sept's ego. Those words would echo long after the war, because what Germany's best minds realized, in their moment of defeat, was that their brilliance had become their blindness. They had built machines that tested men, while their enemies built machines that empowered them. Some test pilots at Rechlin began to admire the enemy's creation not out of betrayal, but out of respect. Flying was their calling, not their ideology. And in the Mustang, they saw the future they had dreamed of as young men, before war twisted invention into survival. It was, Lurch later wrote, what flying was meant to be before it became war. That small moment, one German pilot's awe inside an American cockpit, became a silent turning point. It did not save the Luftwaffe. It did not change the war. But it changed understanding. It showed that progress wasn't set about flags or empires, but about empathy between man and machine. In that understanding, something remarkable happened. The last flicker of Luftwaffe pride became something more enduring, respect for the art of flight itself. Even as the Third Reich began to collapse in early 1945, the work at Rechlin continued. Amid the chaos among bomb craters and dwindling supplies, German engineers remained meticulous. They were scientists first, and defeat could not silence their curiosity. The captured P-51 Mustang was now designated Irreprobung P-51B, the evaluation unit's official test aircraft. Every bolt, every rivet, every panel was catalogued. The Luftwaffe wanted to understand how the Americans had built something so balanced, so deceptively simple. Lurch's initial flight had opened the door. Now came the deep study. Control tests under varying fuel loads. Climb rates across altitudes. STOL characteristics with combat trim. Comparative turn performance against the WWII. They even filmed portions of the flights, using cameras mounted on chase planes, hoping to record data for future generations of German engineers. At a time when most of Germany was burning, these men were still chasing perfection, not out of loyalty to a cause, but to a craft. For many, it was the last act of a dying brotherhood, pilots and engineers who had lived for the pursuit of flight itself. It was madness, Lurch recalled years later. We knew the war was ending, but the work gave us purpose. In studying the Mustang, we touched the standard of what aviation could be. Even as the front drew nearer, test flights continued. Sometimes the rumble of distant guns could be heard from the cockpit. Yet Lurch climbed into the Mustang again and again, testing dive acceleration, gunnery sight calibration, and engine performance at altitude. The irony was profound. Each sortie risked capture or death, to test an aircraft that symbolized the very force destroying their homeland. But for Lurch, it was never about politics. It was about understanding what had made the sky no longer theirs. In that cockpit, he wrote, I could forget the uniforms, the orders, the insignias. It was just man and machine, and the truth between them. The Rechlin engineers compiled their final report in February 1945. It ran over 100 pages, meticulous, objective, even admiring. In its closing paragraph was a single understated sentence. The American P-51 Mustang demonstrates a balance of performance, reliability and pilot accommodation not yet achieved in our own production aircraft. That quiet line was more than an assessment. It was an obituary for the Luftwaffe's dominance, for the myth of German invincibility, and for an era when pride mattered more than practicality. The tests were complete. The lessons learned, too late to matter for war, but not for history. The Luftwaffe had tested the enemy Sep's wings, and discovered not humiliation, but a mirror. By the spring of 1945, the Third Reich was crumbling from the inside out. Berlin was surrounded. Allied armies were advancing from every direction. And at Rechlin, Germany's crown jewel of aviation testing, time was running out. The engineers who had studied the captured Mustang for months now faced a bitter choice: destroy their work or leave it for the victors. For weeks, they'd risked everything to understand the enemy's aircraft, and now, that same aircraft was about to fall back into enemy hands. "We had done all we could," wrote Hauptmann Hans-Werner Lurch. "The Mustang had taught us more about flight than all our arrogance ever had. It felt wrong to burn it." Some Luftwaffe officers ordered all secret aircraft destroyed, the Me-262S, the prototypes, the captured planes. But at Rechlin, the order was only half followed. The Mustang was hidden, covered under tarps, pushed to the edge of the field. Perhaps, even then, there was a flicker of respect too strong to kill. On May 2, 1945, Allied forces reached the test center. What they found was a graveyard of German aviation, jets, rocket planes, blueprints scattered across hangars. And in one corner, almost untouched, stood a familiar silhouette, the P-51 Mustang. An American officer recognized it immediately, though the black cross on its wings told a strange story. It was like finding an old friend wearing the enemy Sep's uniform. He later recalled, the captured Mustang, once the pride of Luftwaffe engineers, once a forbidden marvel, was now back in the hands of those who built it. The irony was not lost on anyone. The aircraft that had symbolized Allied dominance had, for a time, flown under German colors, but even in enemy service, it had never betrayed its purpose. It had remained what it was built to be, a machine for freedom of the sky. Lurcher and his colleagues surrendered without resistance. He handed over his flight logs to the Allied officers, meticulous notes written in perfect technical German. The Americans were astonished. They tested her better than we did. One US intelligence officer admitted. Those documents, along with the surviving Mustang, were shipped back to Allied bases for study. But their true legacy went beyond metal or paper, because in that final handover, between enemies who had studied and destroyed one another, there was a rare moment of human clarity, a recognition that even in war, knowledge, respect, and the pursuit of excellence could transcend flags. Perhaps, he wrote years later, the Mustang was not the enemy. It was simply the sky, reminding us what we had forgotten. The Luftwaffe had captured the Mustang, but in the end, it was the Mustang that captured them. May 1945, the guns had fallen silent, and the Reich that once promised 1,000 years had lasted barely 12. The Luftwaffe, once the most feared air force in the world, was gone. Its pilots, men who had lived and died by the sky, now stood in lines, handing over their pistols, flight jackets, and dreams. Among them was Hauptmann Hans-Werner Lurch. He was taken into Allied custody, but unlike many, he wasn't treated as an enemy mastermind. He was treated as what he truly was, an aviator, a student of flight. During debriefings, American intelligence officers pored over his meticulous logs, pages upon pages, detailing not only the Mustang, but dozens of Allied aircraft tested during the war. His reports read like a love letter to aviation. One US officer remarked, Lurcher was interrogated, questioned, and finally released in 1946. He never flew in combat again, but he did return to the skies as a test pilot for civil aviation in the years that followed. He would later write, "When I flew the Mustang, I realized the war was already lost. We were chasing ghosts, while the Allies were already flying the future." The captured Mustang at Rechlin was shipped back to Britain for further study. It became a curiosity among engineers, a symbol of how far the Allies had advanced. Some of the data from those German flight tests even found its way into post-war design discussions, influencing the next generation of jet aircraft. Meanwhile, the engineers who once worked under the Nazi banner were scattered across the world, some joining Soviet programs, others taken west under Operation Paperclip. But for many, the lessons of the war and the aircraft they had studied would stay with them forever. Because the Mustang was not merely a machine. It was the embodiment of what air power had become: precision, endurance, and mastery through cooperation and design, not ideology. In the decades that followed, veterans on both sides, American and German, met again at reunions, air shows, and museums. They shook hands, exchanged memories, and sometimes stood together beside a restored P-51 Mustang. "When I see her now," Lurch once said in his later years, "I no longer see an enemy. I see the best that human hands can create, and the worst that human hearts can destroy." War had torn their world apart, but flight, in its purest form, still bound them together. The captured Mustang, the one that once wore both stars and crosses, was eventually lost to history. Some say it was dismantled, others that it was left to rust in an Allied depot. But its story, recorded in flight logs and memories, lived on. The war ended, but the sky, it remembers. Every contrail, every echo carries a whisper from those who once dared to rule it. And perhaps, in that endless blue above us, there still flies the spirit of that captured Mustang. A reminder that even in the darkest times, humanity's reach for the skies can reveal both its brilliance and its blindness. The story of the captured Mustang is more than a tale of one aircraft, one flight, or even one war. It is a reminder of human ingenuity, courage, and the humility that comes when excellence meets respect. In 1944, German pilots flew an enemy fighter and admitted they had never seen handling like it. It shattered their confidence, exposed the limits of pride, and offered a rare lesson that mastery is not measured by ideology nor by tradition, but by the understanding of what truly serves the human being, in this case, the pilot. The Mustang SEP's influence did not end with the war. Its design philosophy shaped post-war aviation. Its performance set new benchmarks, and its story inspired generations of pilots, on both sides of the conflict, to respect the delicate dance between man and machine. History often celebrates victories and losses, the battles, the strategies, the famous names. But sometimes, the most profound lessons come from a moment of quiet revelation in a cockpit over a frozen airfield, where even an enemy can teach you the limits of what you thought you knew. The captured Mustang reminds us that technology can awe, that humility can teach, and that even in war, respect for excellence transcends sides. It is a story of courage, curiosity, and the human spirit, echoes that still resonate in the sky today. If this story moved you, like, comment, and subscribe for more echoes of history. Because these stories of bravery, innovation, and humanity deserve to be remembered, long after the guns have fallen silent.